CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. China mourns its former president Jiang Zemin, who has died at the age of 96. His time in office saw the country opening up and high-speed growth.
Our collective resolve to support Ukraine is and will continue to be ironclad.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken tells NATO Vladimir Putin is taking out his anger on Ukraine's civilians and his strategy will not work.
Yearly inflation in the Eurozone eases for the first time in 18 months, dropping to 10% in November.
The first drug to slow down the destruction of the brain in Alzheimer's disease is hailed as the breakthrough the world has been waiting for.
And two of the world's greatest players face each other as Argentina take on Poland at the World Cup in Qatar.
China is mourning the country's former president, Jiang Zemin, who's died at the age of 96. He passed away in Shanghai.
His death was announced to all Chinese Communist Party members, all military forces and the Chinese people. His period in office saw the country opening up and rapid growth.
Jiang Zemin was born on August 17, 1926, in Yangzhou City of Jiangsu Province and joined the Communist Party of China in April 1946, 3 years before the founding of the People's Republic of China. Jiang graduated from the Electrical Machinery Department of Shanghai Jiaotong University in 1947. In 1985, he became mayor of Shanghai and the secretary of the CPC Shanghai Municipal Committee. In 1989, Jiang was elected as a member of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee and General Secretary of the CPC Central Committee. In the same year, he was elected as chairman of the CPC Central Military Commission. A year later, Jiang became the chairman of the PRC Central Military Commission. He was at the core of the CPC's third generation of central collective leadership and the principal founder of the theory of three represents. During his inspection tour in Maoming, Guangdong Province in February 2000, Jiang first introduced the theory of three represents to define the new relationship between the party and the people, and characterizing the CPC as representing the development trend of China's advanced productive forces, representing the orientation of China's advanced culture, and representing the fundamental interests of the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people. The theory was ratified at the 16th CPC National Congress in November 2002 with Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and Deng Xiaoping theory, and was written into the party constitution. In 2004, it was also written into the Chinese constitution at the second session of the 10th National People's Congress. During his time in office, Jiang upheld the principles of peaceful reunification and one country, two systems, witnessing the return of Hong Kong and Macau. Under his leadership, the country pursued an independent foreign policy of peace, opening a new chapter in its diplomatic work. The death of Jiang was announced via a letter addressing the whole party, the entire military, and the Chinese people of all ethnic groups. The letter read that Jiang Zemin was an outstanding leader that enjoyed high prestige. It also acknowledged him as a great Marxist, proletarian revolutionary, military strategist, diplomat, and an outstanding leader of the great cause of socialism with Chinese characteristics.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Vladimir Putin is taking out his anger on Ukraine's civilians and that his strategy will not work.
It comes as NATO foreign ministers meet for a second day in Romania to decide further support for Ukraine amid widespread power cuts and water shortages caused by Russian attacks on infrastructure.
Ministers have also pledged to help Moldova, Georgia and Bosnia, which NATO says are being pressured by Russia. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Pablo Guterres in Bucharest. Pablo, what else have NATO ministers been saying today?
Well, Jamie, there are concerns that Russia will try to destabilize nations in the West Balkans. That is why NATO is pledging to support them. They're also going to be sending aid to help Ukraine survive this winter. A deadly winter looms in Ukraine, with citizens not just facing bombs from the sky, but also plunging temperatures. Russian missile attacks have wiped out nearly half of the country's power grid in recent weeks and damaged most of the water supply infrastructure in Kyiv. With limited electricity, heat, water, and freezing temperatures ahead, many Ukrainians face an impossible choice.
It is painful to see the destruction that the air and missiles attacks by Russia are causing on Ukrainians, on Ukrainian cities, on critical infrastructure.
In response, NATO has pledged a robust package of both humanitarian and military aid, including money to repair infrastructure, generators to power homes, and weapons to fight off drones. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba says Russia is using winter as a weapon to punish the civilian population.
Some deliveries are more complicated than others. I can tell you that bringing a transformer to Ukraine is probably, logistically, is probably even more difficult than bringing an air defense system.
Despite NATO's commitment, there's concern among some allies that the desperately needed aid might not arrive in time. Western allies face a tight deadline and many challenges in helping Ukraine rebuild its infrastructure. There's concerns that once those facilities are repaired, Russia could simply target them once again. Some of the parts needed to get that power grid back up and running could be hard to come by. And in such a vast country, there's the recognition that it's simply impossible to protect every single piece of critical infrastructure. NATO foreign ministers have been joined by their counterparts from Bosnia-Herzegovina, Georgia, and the Republic of Moldova in Bucharest amid fears that Russia will try to destabilize the region by limiting energy supplies and driving fuel prices even higher. NATO officials also announced a significant breakthrough in negotiations with Turkey to sign off on Sweden and Finland's bid to join the alliance. Only Turkey and Hungary have yet to approve their membership. NATO Secretary General says the ratification process is nearly complete and that it is time to welcome them as fully fledged members. And Hungary said at the conclusion of these talks that they will back Sweden and also Finland's bid to join the alliance. They are planning to ratify this next year in February. Back to you.
Pablo, thank you for that. Our correspondent Pablo Guterres in Bucharest.
The European Union will try to set up a specialised court backed by the United Nations to investigate and prosecute possible war crimes committed in Ukraine. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says Brussels will also look to confiscate frozen Russian assets to punish Moscow for its invasion. Our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Moscow. Stuart, has there been any response from Russia to these proposals from Brussels?
Not to these ones from the European Union, but the European Union isn't the first bloc or nation to come up with such an idea when it comes to money especially. So starting with that and the 300 billion euros of Russian central bank money that is currently frozen by the European Union, the response is likely to be similar to what the Kremlin official Dmitry Peskov said when the United Nations started to talk about doing something similar, with many nations voting in seizing Russian assets and using them to fund rebuilding in Ukraine. At the time, earlier in November, Dmitry Peskov said that's tantamount to racketeering and formalizing robbery. He said that doing so would violate all the foundations of international law and private property, and Russia would do everything it can to make sure this doesn't happen. That came with a few threats as well from various figures in the Russian parliament, lawmakers as well as those holding high-up positions, they are, a few of them, suggesting that should action be taken of this sort, then Russia would simply do the same, whether that be corporations, Western corporations and individuals who have business here in Russia, or other currency that Russia has access to, some of which has already been frozen itself. As to the possibility of a tribunal, Maria Zakharova, the Foreign Affairs Ministry spokesperson, did not address again these EU claims, but after similar comments were made by NATO, she said this, that NATO countries are trying to accuse Russia of the criminal acts and atrocities that are committed by the Ukrainian armed forces. Russia, throughout the so-called special military operation, has denied its forces have engaged in any war crimes.
And Stuart, Russia's defence minister has been talking about the country's nuclear forces. What's he had to say?
Yeah, that's right. Any headline with nuclear does tend to spook the world at the moment with the severity of what's going on here, especially as Russia considers it is in effect fighting a proxy war with the United States. These particular comments were a reference by the Russian defense minister to the budget for next year and the kind of priorities they will be looking at when it comes to spending that money. He's saying that the strategic missile infrastructure, which would then send any nuclear weapons should they ever be launched, needs to be upgraded, and it's looking at spending money on upgrading that infrastructure. But separately, on the same time, on Wednesday, there was more discussion about US-Russia talks, which would eventually hope to see a renewal to the New START treaty, which stops the number or limits the number of warheads the US and Russia have deployed. They have stalled again after disagreements about what exactly is open for discussion, with the United States wanting, it says, to resume in-person inspections of weapons, but Russia saying it's not ready for that. And similarly, with the state of geopolitical tensions, not ready for talks at the moment at all. They've been postponed to next year, but there are still, on both sides, interest in arranging some kind of new deal that would keep those limits in place.
Stuart, thank you very much. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, our monthly wages, the global wage report for 2022, highlighting the impact that coronavirus and rising inflation is having.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
This is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Roger, sir.
We can try out the wild and crazy idea.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms. On Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
There's been a major breakthrough into research into Alzheimer's, the disease that causes gradual and severe loss of brain function.
An experimental drug proved successful in slowing cognitive decline during an 18-month trial, although around 13% of patients suffered serious side effects. It's been jointly developed by Japanese pharma firm Eisai and US biotech company Biogen and works to remove proteins that build up in the brains of patients.
Well, let's talk to Professor Bart de Stroeper, Director of the UK Dementia Research Institute at University College of London. And Professor, welcome. Well, first question, just how significant is this drug? Give us an idea of how momentous this is.
Well, this is a major breakthrough, and that's something which we are waiting for 20 years. It's the first drug which really does something on this disease. It shows that we can do something on this disease. The clinical output is undeniably clear. So it's really a big success.
Families and patients obviously will have their hopes raised massively by these headlines. Yeah. But I want to ask you how this will change the lives of patients with Alzheimer's. Is it everyone with Alzheimer's?
No, it's going to be a subgroup of patients which we still need to decide who will be the best group for being treated here. It's certainly going to be used for early Alzheimer's disease, so while there is still sufficient brain capacity in place to preserve it. It's an expensive drug with some side effects. I think 15% is a bit exaggerated. Most of the side effects have no clinical repercussions. It's only in a few rare cases that it's really severe. But still, there are side effects, so this drug has to be given in a very careful way.
Time scale, can you give us any steer as to when patients open the tablets?
The company says that they have submitted to the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and that they expect some answer in the beginning of next year. And they have also submitted in other countries, UK, Europe, Japan. The data are very sound, so I'm quite positive. So that's something for next year.
On the business side of all of this, just how big is the potential Alzheimer's drugs market around the world?
Well, it's huge. So there are about 55 million patients with dementia. It's not Alzheimer's. Dementia is broader. 55 million with dementia, that's equal to the number of cancer patients in the world. And we expect it to if there is no treatment, to triplicate to 2050. So this is a huge market.
What are the side effects that you know of?
Yes, so there is. This is an antibody, and apparently it leads to small bleedings in the brain in some patients, and also some edema and swellings. So that's kind of worrying. But on the other hand, as the company also reported, and from other studies, we know that only a very small percentage of these people who are suffering from that are really in trouble. So we need to further look at that. So, for instance, it seems that using at the same time blood thinners, anticoagulation therapies, that would increase seriously the side effects. But that has to be further investigated.
Professor, I'm sure we'll talk again in coming months. For the moment, thanks for your time and your expertise. Professor Bart de Stroeper, Director of the UK Dementia Research Institute at University College London.
Thank you. You're welcome.
The US economy has grown by more than expected in the third quarter. Annual GDP published in the last few hours is up by 2.9%. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, who's in New York for us. So, John, this sounds like good news.
I know. Oh, well, recession? What recession? You know, despite everything I've been telling you on this programme, we still can't seem to find an entry point into recession, which I guess is a good thing. But the trouble is everybody's looking for it and everybody expects it. The economy here in the third quarter grew far better than anybody had been anticipating, and that despite very high inflation. It's still around about a 40-year high, still very elevated, and despite high interest rates, and of course rent and food are still very high here, even though there are plenty of signs now that inflation is beginning to calm down. So in the third quarter, the revised figure, and I should point out, by the way, they always give us a little peek behind the curtains in October, and then another little peek behind the blinds in November. So this is the second look we've had, and they revised it upwards by a little bit to 2.9%, because it was 2.6% first time round. Now, the history of this is that in the first quarter, the figure certainly was negative, but it was doubtful because we were all coming off the back of the Omicron variant. The second quarter here, the economy was negative by 0.6%, but nobody wants to admit that there may be a recession in town, even though 2 negative quarters a recession do indeed make. And so now we have this figure. So, who knows, really? We'll just have to wait and see what actually happens. Now, it's not all good news, because consumer confidence came down in the month of November for the second month, as announced by the Conference Board today. And that's a sign that people in America may be fearing a recession either towards the end of this year, well, it's a bit late for that now, but in 2023, possibly early. And then another piece of data, which people around the world won't have heard of this, but it's actually very important. It's called the Chicago PMI. And basically, it's a manufacturing index for the city and the region of Chicago, which is the country's second biggest city. And so when Chicago talks, people listen. And the number came in below 40. Now, you don't need to worry about 40, but think about this. It's never been below 40 when the US hasn't been either going into, in a recession, or coming out of a recession. So that's another... it goes against the grain when it comes to the jobs and when it comes to the GDP that we've been talking about. Also today, the ADP jobs report was out. That's the private jobs report. It showed 127,000 new jobs added in the month of November. That's half what it was last month as the tech jobs losses begin to kick in. DoorDash is laying off people now, we're told today, because they say we're not profitable. We need to realign our business for a potential recession next year. AMC Media Networks is laying off lots of people in a sign that there could be turmoil ahead for the media industry. And all of this means the markets here today are mixed. The Dow is down 176, 0.5%. NASDAQ's up by about 1/5%, and the S&P 500 is down 6 points at the moment, but still on track for its second month in the green. So we're all over the place here, really, guys.
John, everyone is still worried about inflation, though. What does this GDP number mean for that?
I think it means that there are signs it is beginning to slow quite substantially now in the fourth quarter, the one we're in, October, November, December. It was clearly still hot in the third quarter, which was June, July and August. And that's funny because we've been talking about a recession seriously since about June. It is possible that there won't be a recession, folks. You know that, don't you? It's possible that they could engineer what's known as a soft landing. And the job employment numbers are still pretty good. The retail sales numbers are pretty good. The retail earnings last week were very, very strong. So again, we just have to wait and see. But what's going to happen today, which is very significant, is Jerome Powell, the head of the central bank, is going to make a major positioning speech. He's going to the Brookings Institute on Think Tank Row in Washington, D.C., where all the big brains hang out. And he's going to basically remind America that this is still a serious situation. There are more interest rate hikes to come. But Wall Street thinks he'll hint at a 50 basis point increase on December the 14th, not a 75 basis point increase. So that will be a tip of the hat in the direction that inflation is indeed starting to slow down. But the markets are still tepid, and they've been that way for the last week, but they will react to what he says at 13:30 GMT today in about 2 hours.
And John, more headlines around Elon Musk and Twitter, and he's made another controversial move.
Well, we couldn't do a programme without Elon Musk. Well, we'd be bereft. There'd be a 7-minute hole in every programme if Elon Musk didn't pronounce something. And he's pronounced, well, at least Twitter has pronounced, or made it clear on their website that they're no longer enforcing their rules about misinformation regarding COVID-19. And they apparently stopped it last Wednesday, the 23rd. Now, the old Twitter had about 11,000 people oiked off in September because of misinformation about COVID. And they had a policy, I think, of 5 strikes and you're out. So you could say 5 things and then they would start to punish you by removing you for a while or indeed permanently. It's not clear whether the people who've been taken off will be allowed back on or whether people will be emboldened because of this to create new accounts that then give misinformation about COVID-19. None of that we know at the moment. All we know is that this has happened, and I just think it's a warning to all of us when it comes to COVID issues to consult our medical professionals and not rely on social media, because this kind of thing is not really where social media excels itself, is it?
John, thank you very much. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
Yearly inflation in the Eurozone has eased marginally for the first time in 18 months, dropping from 10.6% in October to 10% in November.
But food price inflation is continuing to accelerate, according to the latest figures from the EU statistical agency Eurostat. The figures are likely to influence the central bank's next interest rate hike, expected next month.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Rosie Burchard in Brussels. Rosie, so what's driven this small, it must be said, small fall?
Well, for months I have been reporting on new records broken for inflation in the Eurozone. This is now, for the first time in almost a year and a half, as you rightly pointed out, a marginal moderation in that trend. So now down to 10% from 10.6%. Now, what is seen to be driving this really is a slight moderation in those soaring energy bills. You've heard me tell you a lot that households, businesses across this European Union and those 19 countries which use the euro currency have been suffering under very high energy bills. Now, we saw extremely high gas prices, for example, in August. Those have come down substantially now. Some experts citing, for example, that European countries have managed to fill up their gas reserves for winter. Also, they've managed to diversify quite significantly away from reliance on Russia, previous reliance on Russia when it comes to fossil fuel imports. So this looks to be a small relief, but no full respite yet. Some economists are predicting we could see inflation rise once again when the next figures come out in a month's time. I should note that these are flash estimates from Eurostat, and they will be confirmed with more robust data in a couple of weeks' time.
Well, that taken on board, I mean, optimists will still think this is important if the trend continues for economic recovery in the Eurozone.
Absolutely. The hope is that this now means the peak has passed, that there has been a peak in inflation, 10.6%, and now that the trend will be going down. But I should say that the prospects here, the economic mood in Brussels is still a very gloomy one. The European Commission is still officially forecasting a recession for the winter, so Q4 that we're currently in and Q1 of 2023, it's forecasting contraction there. The European Commission, however, does say that its job market, the job market here in the European Union, remains the bright spot of the EU economy. That's because unemployment remains remarkably low despite all these negative trends. However, they are also predicting on that front that growth of employment is likely to steady, to go kind of flat in 2023 before recovering again in 2024. So despite this, some will hope that this is the beginning of a downward trend. Not yet any sort of firm relief, and I should say we are likely still to see the European Central Bank continue on its plan to raise interest rates in a bid to drive down inflation. What some economists are saying is that this slightly moderating inflation figure could mean that we see the ECB tend more toward a 0.5% interest rate hike when its rate setters meet in December, rather than the jumbo rate hikes of 0.75% that we've seen at the last meetings.
Rosie, thank you for that. Our correspondent Rosie Burchard in Brussels.
The luxury handbag maker Mulberry has posted a $4.8 million loss for the 6 months to October. The company's been hit by a downturn in online shopping in Britain and the cost of living crisis. Mulberry said revenues had improved in the past 2 months, but warned that the economic climate remained challenging. HSBC will close 114 of its UK branches from April, the latest in a string of high street banking closures to cut costs. The British bank says the move is also due to a change in customer habits, with more people banking online. HSBC says it will invest tens of millions of dollars in updating its remaining 327 branches in the UK.
More than 10,000 ambulance staff across England and Wales have voted to strike, the latest in a wave of industrial action over pay and conditions. Unions say staffing levels in Britain's ambulance service have now reached a critically low point, threatening the safety of staff and patients. Talks will take place to decide when the strikes will happen in the run-up to Christmas. The Chinese electric car maker XPeng has posted a bigger-than-expected loss of over $300 million for the third quarter. It delivered a peak of just over 15,000 vehicles in June, but that number is expected to drop by half in November and December. The company's growth has been hit by coronavirus lockdowns in China and rising costs, forcing it to increase the price of its cars.
The International Labour Organization has released its Global Wage Report for 2022, which highlights the impact that COVID and rising inflation is having on purchasing power. The study shows a dramatic fall in real monthly wages during the first half of the year. In G20 countries, which account for well over half of the world's employees who earn a wage, real wages fell by 2.2%. And in 4 countries, the UK, Italy, Mexico and Japan, in real terms, wages in 2022 were lower than they were 14 years ago. Well, let's talk now to Rosalia Vazquez-Alvarez, who's an econometrician and wage specialist for the International Labour Organization, who commissioned this report. Welcome to the programme, Rosalia. So we're seeing wages here falling in real terms for the first time since 2008. What's behind it?
Yes, hello, good afternoon. So what you have said is correct. The global wage growth has declined to minus 0.9% across the world. If we take China out, because China has a huge specific weight in this estimate, it has even fallen more globally, which is at minus 1.4%. What's behind it? We think that one of the key factors is, of course, the rise in inflation. As inflation has increased across the world, and it started in 2021, way before the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine war, then clearly the rise in inflation has eroded real wages, which have declined in a significant number of countries. And as you well said, in advanced G20 economies, it declines by minus 2.2%. In emerging economies, it has actually kept positive at 0.8%, but that's because it has China inside. If we take China out, they have also declined in real terms.
And how has the coronavirus pandemic played into this?
Well, the coronavirus, it's difficult to say because the two crises, the coronavirus crisis and the cost of living crisis, interact at some point between 2021 and 2022. We think that perhaps there has been a decline in nominal wages as a result of a decline in the number of hours worked per worker across the world. So as long as we don't actually recover to pre-COVID levels, it may be the case that some of this decline is due to a decline in nominal wages. But clearly the bulk of the decline is due to increasing cost of living, increasing inflation, and the nominal wages not adjusted for inflation in the vast majority of countries, particularly in high-income countries.
And you mentioned China. Are we seeing the same picture around the world when it comes to wages, or are any countries bucking the trend?
The advanced G20 economies are the ones that are actually suffering the greatest decline, the ones that show the greatest negative growth. There are some countries in emerging economies like Brazil, which is also declining significantly. In fact, in Brazil, wages have declined by 6.9% in 2022. It comes from a previous decline of minus 7% in 2021. But let's just say that the big advanced economies like the US, the UK, countries in the European Union are the ones that are driving the trends in terms of negative growth. And this is because in advanced economies, in high-income countries, inflation is much higher than in low-income countries and emerging economies.
And what about the number of jobs out there? The labour market's not in good shape at the moment. What impact will that have? So what we see is that employment has actually gone back steadily towards levels seen before the pandemic. What we have also seen is that in many emerging economies, where informality is significant, usually, informality has increased. And what impact it may have if we keep on having wages declining in real terms, that may actually have an impact in terms of job creation at some point in the future. Because, of course, if wages decline, that also means that the purchasing power of families, of workers, of the population in general will decline, and it may have a negative impact in terms of aggregate demand. Rosalia Vázquez Alvarez from the ILO, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you to you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, changing places in space. China's astronauts get ready to swap crews.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background.
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. China mourns its former president, Jiang Zemin, who's died at the age of 96. His time in office saw the country opening up and high-speed growth.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken tells NATO Vladimir Putin is taking out his anger on Ukraine's civilians and his strategy will not work.
And yearly inflation in the Eurozone eases for the first time in 18 months, dropping to 10% in November.
The crews of China's Shenzhou 15 and Shenzhou 14 have met in space for the country's first ever crew change over on the space station.
Our correspondent Wu Lei reports.
我们奉命执行神舟15号载人航天飞行任务，准备完毕。 Shenzhou 15 crew are ready to start their 6-month journey in space. At least 2 batches of astronauts will be sent into space each year starting in 2023. We will witness these kinds of seeing-off ceremonies twice a year. The Shenzhou 15 crew lifted off on late Tuesday night.
今天成功的发射感到非常的激动，也非常
I feel really excited and happy about the successful launch today. This is China's 10th manned mission. It's not easy at this point. From the first launch in 2003 to the last launch of the space station's construction phase today, our manned space missions have achieved continuous success. As part of China's aerospace industry, I feel very proud.
After a 6-hour journey, they met the Shenzhou 14 crew, who has been anxiously awaiting their arrival. Shenzhou 14 crew commander Chen Dong said it's a moment of excitement and pride they've longed for, and the incoming Shenzhou 15 crew said they can't wait to roam around their home in space, which now comfortably holds 6 people. This first rotation between Shenzhou crews also shows how China's space station has got into a 3-module, 3-ship T-shape configuration. For the first time, the biggest, most complicated in the entire build-up of the space station, and the heaviest to date at around 100 tons. This is the first in-orbit rotation in the history of China's space station. The 2 crews will conduct a work handover over the next few days, as the Shenzhou 14 crew prepares to return to Earth. The 6-person stay might be short, but it will become increasingly regular, with crew rotation planned for twice a year going forward. For now, the 6 astronauts on board will continue to look ahead. Wu Lei, CGTN.
European Council President Charles Michel will meet Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing on Thursday. Economic ties are likely to be high on the agenda after European leaders expressed concern about an over-reliance on China.
Michel and Xi are also expected to discuss global challenges, including the war in Ukraine and climate change. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Alex, just how significant is this visit for the EU?
Well, it's a very significant visit. It'll be the first in-person bilateral between Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, and President Xi Jinping. It'll be quite a long time coming. Charles Michel announcing this a few weeks ago, and it's very much a high-profile meeting for the Council President. It's going to be quite a quick visit, very similar to the one that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made just a month ago, a 24-hour flying visit for the EU officials to comply with China's COVID regulations. And it'll be a 3-hour meeting between President Xi and Charles Michel, a bilateral meeting to begin with, followed by a lunch, is the indication that we're having here in Brussels. He'll also meet with the Chinese premiers as well as other leaders in his time there. Very high-profile meeting. As you said, there are a lot of things in common that are going to be discussed, namely like global partnerships. But the main agenda points that the EU officials are saying will be on the table: geopolitical developments, economic developments, and global challenges. Now, out of those global challenges, there are some that the EU and China will work together on. The EU officials saying climate change is going to be very high up on that list, as will health. So those are the kind of key core issues where they're hoping to find common ground in this trip. And obviously, it's part of a broader context of European leaders going to China, trying to build on that relationship. As I said, Olaf Scholz of Germany going last month, and President Macron of France planning to go at the start of next year. So definitely a shift in those bilateral relationships, those bilateral meetings. Those leaders were all at the G20 summit in Bali a couple of weeks ago. So talks, informal talks happening there. But this is certainly a very serious, very high-profile meeting for one of the EU's top officials going to Beijing and travelling there, meeting on Thursday tomorrow.
Alex, in terms of hard outcomes, what will the EU be hoping to achieve?
Well, as you said, one of the key issues to be discussed, and there's something where there isn't necessarily alignment, but certainly space for discussion, will be that war in Ukraine. The European Union hoping to have open conversations with China about perhaps shifting their support of Russia or their position on the war in Ukraine. That's one of the things that EU officials are saying behind the scenes will be quite important to President Charles Michel. Obviously, there's a difference of views there, and so a conversation is needed and discussions will be needed, and really pushing for international law to be at the middle of the discussions around that war, but also things like reform of the World Trade Organization, something that the EU sees China as a potential partner in. Those will be key outcomes, key deliverables for Charles Michel and his team when traveling to Beijing. But as I said, climate change will be an issue of global and vital importance for Charles Michel and his team traveling to Beijing. They really do see work that has happened in the past and work that is ongoing in collaborating with China as very productive and very constructive. So those are the issues, but there's certainly a difference in views, a difference in values that Charles Michel's team have recognized. The President of the EU Council just over a month ago at the EU Council meeting saying the European Union and China have different softwares. They operate differently. We have to understand that, but we can't be in a position of systematic opposition. We do need to find common ground to work together. So certainly a lot on the table, diverging views, differences over Russia and the war in Ukraine, but also things in common like climate change and health. So a bit of a diplomatic tightrope for Charles Michel to be walking along. Some European member states pushing for a lot more strategic autonomy and really trying to distance the European Union's relationship with China. Other member states, notably Germany, for example, we look at the port of Hamburg saying, well, we need to have this mutually beneficial economic relationship. So that's the kind of tricky balancing act that Charles Michel is going to try to achieve in Beijing.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels.
French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Washington for the first state visit since President Joe Biden took office.
The meeting aims to strengthen Franco-American relations after tensions during the Trump years, but it comes at a time of bitter economic competition. Our correspondent Mark Webster reports.
The French government is depicting this visit as quite a coup for the Élysée Palace. It's the second state visit by President Macron. The first was during Donald Trump's presidency, and he's the first head of state to be invited since President Biden's election. It marks a period of improving relations between the two countries, which hit an icy patch last year when Australia ditched an agreement to buy French submarines and instead formed a three-way deal with the US and UK to build a new generation of nuclear submarines. France wants to underline the close cooperation between it and the US over the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, their similar views on global political challenges, and their mutual commitment to green issues and fighting climate change. But the biggest sticking point will be on trade, especially the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a landmark piece of legislation passed during Mr. Biden's presidency. The French and other European countries see the act, which is designed to encourage Americans to buy US-made electric vehicles, as discriminatory to European manufacturers like Renault or BMW. While it's unlikely President Biden will make any major concessions, France will try to persuade the US to level the playing field so as not to damage the European car industry. Both sides have signalled they don't want this to spark a renewed trade war, but Mr. Macron will hope to persuade his American counterpart that it's in the interests of both sides not to harm European industry. One other issue, which is bound to be raised, is the soaring cost of energy in Europe following the cut in Russian gas and oil supplies. The US is self-sufficient in energy, so France may be looking for a favourable deal on supplies. Mark Webster, CGTN, Paris.
Two members of a far-right militia have been found guilty of sedition in the United States. The founder of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, and group member Kelly Meggs were both convicted over last year's attack on the US Capitol. Rhodes was accused of plotting an armed rebellion to stop the transfer of power from Donald Trump to Joe Biden.
The South Korean truck drivers' strike will go into a second week after the government failed to reach a deal with the union. It comes a day after the government invoked a law forcing drivers in the cement industry to go back to work or face penalties. The truckers are on strike over pay.
The baguette, France's iconic loaf of bread, is perhaps one of the most recognisable symbols of the country's cuisine. Now it's been added to the United Nations Cultural Heritage List. It's been given that honour to try and preserve the traditional way it's made and the lifestyle that surrounds it. More than 6 billion baguettes are baked every year in France.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Two of the world's greatest players face each other as Argentina take on Poland at the World Cup in Qatar.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw. The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Travel and tourism was one of the sectors worst hit by COVID lockdowns and travel bans. Leaders in the travel industry are gathered in Saudi Arabia for the 22nd Annual World Travel and Tourism Summit to plan their next moves in the post-pandemic recovery. Well, our correspondent Naweed Jabakal is in the Saudi capital, Riyadh. So, Naweed, what's the atmosphere like where you are? Is there a sense of optimism?
Yeah, I think so, tinged with a bit of caution as well. Just a mention of the summit wrapping up here, so they are deconstructing if you hear anything in the background. But it's rather interesting. Global Business is the name of the programme, and this story, strangely, seems to highlight just how interconnected the business world is. Let's start with what we heard earlier from the ILO and the warning about inflation, cost of living crises, and the COVID-19 pandemic still weighing on many industries and governments and economies. Well, the sector was hurt by the pandemic. We saw those check-in queues closed and airports essentially deserted, as well as runways lying barren with planes grounded. But the bounce back has been very, very quick, and that's been the big message here, I think, as governments and economies look to recover. Travel could be one sector that's worth focusing on.
The global damage caused by COVID-19 has been well documented, but few sectors have been hit as hard as the travel industry, or bounced back as strongly. After a bruising few years of lockdowns, job losses and standstills, many here are looking firmly ahead.
1 in 10 jobs on this planet come from travel and tourism, and 1 in 10 dollars that are made come from travel and tourism. That's jobs with dignity. So we are a growth sector. 1 in 4 of every new job on this planet is going to be in our sector.
This year's global summit is being held in Riyadh, the capital of a country very much on the move. Saudi Arabia feels like a land obsessed with reforms, from the social to the economic, as it looks to wind down its reliance on oil. It wants to roughly triple the role of tourism in its GDP to 10% by the end of this decade.
Normally, in any category, when you have a new brand, there are always the early adopters and there are the laggers and the skeptics and so on. So that bell curve applies to any new brand, whatever that is. And in the brands of cities and destinations, we're going through that curve. You see the influx of our inbound. I mean, the top G20 are still talking recovery, and where we are 120% growth.
The plans announced here are characteristically ambitious. In recent years, Saudi Arabia has pumped tens of billions of dollars of public money into diversifying its economy. There's plenty of skepticism, though, about its plans and ability to pull it off. But alongside government expenditure, it's also seeking foreign investment to help transform travel and tourism here.
It's a new sector for us, so I mean, who are we to claim that we can do it without partners? And how can you talk about partners without addressing the strategic markets? And Chinese investors, we look at them as customers.
In the first 9 months of this year, more than 700 million people visited another country, a resurgence that's benefited from pent-up demand. But with some major markets yet to reopen tourism and an economic downturn in others looming over the industry, there's still some way to go before things get back to normal.
And that scepticism largely centres on politics when it comes to this part of the world. Many people, particularly in industrialised nations, Western nations, will be sceptical about coming here over issues like human rights. We heard earlier about Charles Michel from the European Union, his visit coming up to China and concerns for Chinese businesses there. That doesn't exist here in Saudi Arabia. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and China has strengthened economically in recent years, and that's led to a stronger political relationship. And that's why I think as Saudi Arabia looks to transform with these billions, multi-billion-dollar investments, it may turn east and to China's expertise in particular in helping to build that. Back to you.
Louis, thank you very much. Our correspondent Louis Jabarkil in Riyadh.
Well, the final games in Group C are almost over. Tunisia beating France 1-0.
France had already qualified and rested their star player Kylian Mbappe. And Australia are also winning 1-0 against Denmark.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Dan Williams, watching events in Doha. Dan, we'll quickly gloss over the Wales result. What do these results mean for the outcome of Group D?
Yeah, nail-biting last few moments as these games come to wrap up. Tunisia had 1 foot into the last 16 with Wabi Khazri scoring a goal for them 58 minutes, and that would have put them through as it stood. But then a couple of minutes later in the other game, that Australia goal against Denmark by Matthew Leckie, that meant that Australia is now the team that is set to go through from this group. So very tense indeed. If Denmark can equalise, Tunisia back in the prime seat of going through to the last 16 for the first time in their history.
Two of the world's greatest players come up against each other when Argentina play Poland later.
That's right, yeah. Lionel Messi's Argentina up against Robert Lewandowski's Poland side now. Of course, so much pressure on Argentina following that first defeat against Saudi Arabia. They came back to beat Mexico 2-0, didn't they? But this one certainly... well, there's a lot riding on this one for them. Essentially, a win for Argentina will put them through. A draw might be enough for Poland. Well, if they win, they will definitely go through as group winners. So it's going to be a very interesting battle, this one, as we saw last time out when Lionel Messi, of course, once again stole the show against Mexico, scoring that great goal. We wonder what's going to happen here in this one as well.
And what about the other game in that group?
Yeah, of course, Saudi Arabia, of course, scored that amazing victory against Argentina first time round, that 2-1 victory, turning that group on its head, up against Mexico, this game taking place actually at the Lusail Stadium, and there's actually a China connection with this stadium, as I explain here.
The Lusail Stadium is the centrepiece of the 2022 World Cup. The arena can accommodate more than 80,000 fans and was designed to resemble a traditional Arab bowl. The venue was built as a joint venture with the China Railway Construction Corporation. Wang Li is the managing director of CRCC in the Middle East. He says it was an emotional moment to see World Cup fans inside the stadium.
My tears coming down when I first time to see my stadiums in the TV. The matches between the Argentina and Mexico, which is reaching to the 88,000 spectators, really very proud, very proud.
Lusail is the first FIFA World Cup stadium built by a Chinese company. Li says a key focus was on environmentally friendly building practices that included a design change that reduced the amount of steel by 12,000 tons. Water conservation was a priority too for Qatar's desert environment.
Qatar government wants, to reduce the cost and also to looking for the green energies and green solutions. We have also designed and built the rainwater collecting systems. I would say they have saved energies more than 35 to 40% comparing with the original designs.
Shortly, this stadium will host the final of the 2022 World Cup. It will be here where that famous trophy will be hoisted into the air and legends will be made. For the stadium, it signals the end of a journey, but the beginning of another.
Long term, there are plans to convert the arena into a community space to include a health clinic, a school and sporting facilities.
It's about the possibilities. The structure is there. How you modify the structures and to convert to the other purpose and to make this whole stadium, more useful in the future.
But for now, this is an iconic venue for World Cup 2022, and already it is providing some memorable World Cup moments.
Yeah, I can also just update you in Group D, actually the news coming through, Australia are through to the last 16. They beat Denmark. They're going to go through from Group D with France.
Dan, thanks for that. Enjoy the football. Our correspondent Dan Williams in Doha.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.